Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. I'm in Toronto, and I'd love to invite you to join me on a trip to the Indian Ocean and a little island called, or an archipelago of islands, Diego Garcia. But I can't invite you there because that seems to be inhabited by nuclear weapons these days, and they don't like people like us snooping around. So we're not going to Diego Garcia, and we're going to do the next best thing, which is to have a conversation with Professor David Vine, who is an anthropologist at American University in Washington, D.C. And he is an expert on Diego Garcia and other American bases around the world. So I'm looking forward to this opportunity. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Metta. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's a big thrill for me. And I want to introduce my assistant, Adam Wynn, who is my right-hand man. And I don't have a left-hand man, as a matter of fact, but he's extremely helpful, and he knows quite a bit about Diego Garcia, or at least he did a few years ago when I think he wrote a paper as an undergraduate about the subject, and he shared with me yesterday some slides that he'd made, PowerPoint slides with maps. Okay, now Diego Garcia is, I believe, not one island, but several. Is that right? In the Indian Ocean.
Diego Garcia is one island. It's the largest island in a larger Chagos archipelago, which is a group of about 56 islands, almost directly smack dab in the middle of the Indian Ocean, halfway between Africa and Indonesia and due south of India by about 900 miles.
Okay, all right. I'm glad to be straightened out already. You've got a lot of straightening out to do for me because I really don't know about it, except that I've heard that it is it's a big military base, and it's a place where I believe the U.S. Wants to maintain a foothold in for military purposes throughout Asia, by using places like Diego Garcia. And I think also, is it Guam that is another comparable base that they think they could hang on to Asia if just using those two places as a place. And they used it for the Afghan war as a source. Is that right?
Yeah, you're not alone in knowing little, although you know quite a bit about Diego Garcia, but most people in the United States, most people around the world know nothing about Diego Garcia and its history and its present day use. The base is a very large Air Force, U.S. Air Force and Navy base, and has been since 1971, although it's grown over time, especially in the 1980s and really to the present. It's been a major base during the post 9/11 wars, during all the wars the U.S. has waged in the Middle East since 1980, but especially in the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And I would say it is U.S. government officials, many of them, U.S. military officials, diplomatic officials, who want to hang on to Diego Garcia, despite the fact that its very legality as an entity, really, it is a colony of Great Britain and has been since the 19th century. The legality of that arrangement, and thus the legality of the U.S. occupancy of Diego Garcia and the base there, is in question, to say the least.
Okay, well, I think you're going to have to give us a whole history, because I looked up pictures of Chagosians. Is that what they're called? Yes. The people who inhabited that island and others and have been displaced. And so I didn't know that they existed. How many of them are there, by the way? How many Chagosians in the world?
Now there are many thousands, perhaps up to 8, 9, 10,000. It's a question that gets asked often. When the base on Diego Garcia was established by the U.S. military with the help of the British government in the late 1960s and early 1970s. There were a group of people called the Chagosians who were still living on these islands. Their ancestors had been there for generations, dating back to around the time of the American Revolution.
Oh.
But when the US military became interested in Diego Garcia, US military officials and other US government officials decided they wanted a base where they didn't have to worry about any local population. They didn't want to worry about population protesting outside the gates, as we've seen in places like Okinawa. This was in the era of decolonization, and US military and other government officials were concerned about getting kicked out of islands that they, both islands and other military bases that they maintained around the world. And the United States had created, after World War II, an unprecedented collection of foreign military bases, bases on other people's soil, more bases than any people, empire, or country in world history. But during the era of decolonization, some of the countries that were newly gaining their independence were indeed kicking the US out. Trinidad is one example. US officials were concerned about this and wanted to make sure they could hang on to foreign military bases in virtually perpetuity. So they began looking for islands in particular that they could snap up, acquire, either outright purchasing or gain basing access through an agreement with a close ally like Britain. And Diego Garcia.
I looked up pictures of these people because I wanted to know what kind of folks they look like. Now, you say that they've been there since about the American Revolution. I'm wondering, I read, I don't know whether it's Wikipedia or someplace, that the Portuguese had been slave traders and that they had made a place to imprison or hold some of their slaves on Diego Garcia, and that when they went away, those people stayed on. And I don't know whether they all came from different places and they merged and formed one breeding population or society or not. So, but there were people already there well before these Portuguese brought their slaves. Is that it?
So don't believe everything you read on Wikipedia. Don't read on the internet. In fact, it suggests maybe I should spend more time on Wikipedia. I'd be happy to share resources for your viewers, reputable, reliable resources. But here's the history of the Chagosian people, the short history. Their ancestors arrived there as enslaved people and as indentured laborers, enslaved people from Africa and indentured laborers from India. First, enslaved people were brought there by Mauritians of French ancestry, so Franco-Mauritians, French colonists in the Western Indian Ocean islands of Mauritius, brought enslaved people around the time of the American Revolution, the late 18th century, to Diego Garcia and the other islands in the Chagos archipelago. And those enslaved people, and later joined by indentured laborers from India, built an entire society, colonial society, built around plantations, coconut plantations. After the end of enslavement, after the enslaved people gained their freedom, over time, this diverse group of people of African and Indian ancestry basically formed a new society, indeed, and became known as originally the Ilwa, the Islanders. They formed a new and unique society in the islands and had their own language, traditions, culture, and this is the society that existed there and indeed grew over time into the 1960s, when US government officials began looking around and became interested in creating a military base on Diego Garcia. And when they became interested, as I was saying before, they wanted the base without any local population. So they secretly negotiated with British government officials to get the right to build a base on Diego Garcia and to get the British government to do the dirty work of getting rid of the Chagosians.
I
And the
see.
British government agreed. And the US government paid the British government $14 million to do the dirty work and to get the right to build a base on Diego Garcia.
Mhm.
This was an agreement that was signed in 1966. And between 1968 and 1973, in a variety of ways, the Chagosians were forcibly removed from Diego Garcia and the other Chagos Islands. They were simply left in exile in the Western Indian Ocean islands of Mauritius and the Seychelles. They were given no resettlement assistance. And they were, of course, separated from the land of their ancestors, the land where their ancestors were buried, from their communities, from their jobs, and simply deported and dumped in exile.
In one place or scattered?
In two places in particular. So the island of Mauritius, which had a long-standing relationship with the Chagos Islands, and the Seychelles. Both are 1,200 miles from Diego Garcia and the rest of the Chagos archipelago. So it's not like they were sent next door. They were deported far, far away, and again, separated in a deep sort of sociocultural sense from their homeland. The Chagosians talk about being déracinés in their French and Bantu-based Creole language. They were uprooted, torn from their natal lands. And you can imagine, I hope your viewers can imagine, what the effects of such uprooting are. In fact, research shows that for people around the world, when they are forcibly removed from their homes, the effects are not good.
Okay, and now they were put in two different locations. Have they been able to maintain their identity as a single community, or are these different populations somehow culturally separating now?
That's a great question. They have maintained an identity as a group, now referred to as the Chagosians, and this is because their original name, Ilwa, became something of a slur in exile. People would say Ilwa in a way that became very much a slur, and was one form of the discrimination they faced in exile. There are differences between Chagosians who ended up in Mauritius and those who ended up in the Seychelles. And in recent years, there are thousands actually who, as a result of a now more than 50-year struggle to go home, one of the victories of that struggle they have yet to be able to go home, but they have won a victory in the sense that they got full British citizenship. Because indeed they were British citizens by virtue of being born in a British colony. It's a long story of how they got that citizenship, but thousands have moved to the UK in recent years. And there are differences between the groups now in the UK and mostly in and around London, in the Seychelles and in Mauritius, but they do and have maintained an identity as a single people, a single Chagosian people.
And they have a political, some sort of movement that is a unified one.
Mostly.
Their own leaders and so on.
Yes, indeed. The Chagos Refugees Group is the group that represents the most Chagosians, and they have a branch in the UK and they have a branch in Mauritius. But there are a few other groups representing Chagosians. Often, despite the different groupings, they unify. But like any group of people, there are divisions and tensions. And sadly, the British government in particular has used something of a divide and rule strategy to keep the Chagosians divided. They haven't been very successful because by and large, Chagosians have come together to rally for the right to return and to demand some proper compensation for what they've suffered, for having their homeland stolen from them, for being dumped in exile, given no resettlement assistance. They have won small amounts of compensation in the late 1970s and early 1980s, but this totaled about $6,000 per recipient. $6,000 for having their whole homeland stolen and being dumped in exile. And for some, but not all, their first formal home, a concrete block, cinder block home. Pretty shameful, I would say, form of compensation. And Chagosians since then have been arguing that they are due proper compensation, especially compared to the literally billions of dollars that have been invested in the military base on Diego Garcia. $6,000 is shameful, to say the least.
Mm-hmm. So what happened?
If I may enter.
Yeah, please, Adam, go ahead.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the compensation. Is that the Iloa Trust Fund that was established in 1982? That I thought a element of that trust fund was very disputed, in that they also had to sign away their rights to return to the homeland in order to get compensation. Was that ever overturned?
So it's complicated. The Iloa Trust Fund was established by the Mauritian government as part of that compensation package in the early 1980s. Chagosians did sign a piece of paper written in English, an agreement that many to this day dispute whether it gave away their right to return or gave up their right to return. I think that the important thing is that we're talking about a negotiation that was going on in the 1980s between a small, impoverished group of people who had virtually no power, other than the power to protest and go on hunger strikes as they did and protest in the streets, and the British government. And the British government, with this small, impoverished group of people, said, do you want a few £1,000, or perhaps it was £100 in the day, the $6,000 is adjusted for inflation, or do you want nothing? And these were people who were struggling to feed their families, literally, who were living in shacks. At best, some were living in the forests at times. Some were living, under in cow sheds. As I've done research with the Chagosians and met them in Mauritius and Seychelles, and in those conditions, many of them were willing to sign whatever was put in front of them, especially an agreement in English. If they were literate at all, and many were not because of the poor education they'd received, if any education, they certainly didn't speak English.
Mm-hmm. So when they were initially ousted, they were taken from their homes, they were taken to Mauritius or the Seychelles someplace and just dumped on shore with nothing, or what? Or was there any, there was no arrangement for housing them, or no plan at all? Here, these poor people were just thrown ashore.
The British government took some of the $14 million that the US government paid them, and in the case of the Mauritian government, gave them £3 million and said, you take care of them, you resettle them. And British government officials and US government officials, you can see this in the documentary record, knew that the Mauritian government, which gained its independence in 1968 and was in the midst of unprecedented unemployment and interethnic strife, the US and British officials knew that the Mauritian government was in no position to resettle an entire population. Mm-hmm. The government of the Seychelles was given its first international airport, similarly in exchange for resettling the Chagosians. And it also was in no position to be resettling an entire group of people, or part of the group of people, a smaller number than went to Mauritius. So the Mauritian government over time made some small efforts to resettle the Chagosians, but again, they received effectively no resettlement assistance and were left to fend for themselves in both Mauritius and the Seychelles.
What about the people on the other islands of the Chagos? Are they still there, or are these people who were forcibly ejected from Diego Garcia, are they allowed to go to those other islands? And do they see themselves as part of the same people as the other Chagosian inhabitants?
Yes, the Chagosians do see themselves as one people. There are some distinctions between those who were born and raised and grew up in Diego Garcia, and those who grew up in the other smaller islands. But all the Chagosians were removed from the islands. It was a multi-stage process.
The islands. Oh.
In fact, some of the Chagosians, those in Diego Garcia, went through multiple deportations. Some of them 3 deportations at least. They were deported from Diego Garcia to other islands in the Chagos archipelago, and then subsequently to Seychelles, and then subsequently to Mauritius in some cases. But by 1973, all the Chagosians had been removed from their homelands, from all the islands. Now, you ask, can they go back? No. No one can go to Diego Garcia unless you're in the US military. Journalists haven't been allowed. Human rights investigators haven't been allowed since the early 1980s, when a few journalists were allowed to visit. If you have a yacht, however, and it helps if your skin is white, you can go visit the other islands where there are no military facilities, as far as we know. You can actually see videos online of yachties, as they're known, people with yachts who transit the Indian Ocean, stop there on the other islands. They're 150 miles from Diego Garcia, and the British and US governments allow yachties to go. But when Chagosians have tried to go back, their skin, of course, is brown or black. They've been turned around, they've been stopped. So, this underlines the racism that has shaped this entire story. These were mostly or almost entirely white male, British and US government officials making decisions to deport an entire population of Indian and African ancestry, brown and black folks. Got this Black Lives Matter shirt behind me. That's not just a coincidence. These are other Black and brown lives that have simply not mattered to the US government and the British government.
Is there anybody living on those other islands now?
No, only the yachties.
The yacht people can go there, all right.
And they live there for literally months at a time, while the Chagosians cannot go back.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if I may just add a point, going back to the Harold Wilson administration in the 60s, part of the British government's tactic to remove them, from my understanding, was to completely kind of, I'm trying to think of the right word here, negate the existence of the indigenous population and classify them as workers and not refer to them as indigenous, or simply not to refer to the people at all. And that in itself is an act of violence against them. I'm not sure if my connection is just frozen. It seems to be freezing every few seconds on this. But the Wilson administration, there are some absolutely horrific quotes out of his cabinet from the 60s when this was ongoing, the first round of evictions. And I'm wondering, you mentioned that they were eventually granted British citizenship as being an overseas territory. Was that a result of the UN human rights investigation, or was that the case, I think it was the Banku family, I may not have the pronunciation right on that, that went for the House of Lords? Which one resulted in them getting full citizenship?
Yeah, the UN has played a pretty limited role until recently. And indeed, the UN was in no position to investigate in the 1960s and early 1970s because the US and British governments kept everything secret. They kept the plan for the base secret, they kept the expulsions secret, and they agreed that if any journalists or the UN or other investigators started asking questions, what they would do would be to represent the Chagosians not as the indigenous people of the islands, but as you said, as migrant workers or transient laborers who actually belonged in Mauritius and the Seychelles, so they could send them back home. When they knew that the people had roots in the islands for generations, they knew that this was, as literally it says in a British government document, maintaining the fiction. They knew this was a fiction. They knew they were lying. And the whole story is full of these lies. This is a particularly pernicious lie. There's also a British government official who writes describing the Chagosians as Tarzans and Man Fridays, again, underlining the racism that has shaped this entire story. But it was really only in recent years that the UN began taking more of an interest in the Chagosians and in the legality of British occupation of Diego Garcia and the Chagos Islands.
Well, is there any prospect that things will get better? If you say that now there's kind of a movement, or at least that it's getting some traction, how much traction? What kind of mechanisms exist for them to make stronger claims that might actually have some effect?
So they have had a growing movement. I spoke about their movement in the 70s and 80s, where they were going on hunger strikes, they were protesting, petitioning, and this won them some small compensation, but it was very small, but not insignificant for a deeply impoverished group of people who unfortunately remain among the poorest of the poor in Mauritius and the Seychelles. Some of you, your listeners probably know or think of the islands of Mauritius and Seychelles as gorgeous tropical beach locales and tourist destination. Chagosians generally have been living, again, as the poorest of the poor in both island nations and far from the tourist beaches and hotels. Their movement over time has gained strength and gained support around the world, including with the Banku, as Adam referred to. This is the name of the leader of the Chagos refugees group, Olivier Banku, who has led a series of lawsuits against the British and US governments since the late 1990s. We won a tremendous victory in 2000 over the British government, where the expulsion was ruled unlawful. The litigation has been very long and is complicated, but the long and the short is the British government kept appealing these various decisions and finding other means to overturn the court's decisions, and have succeeded in continuing to bar the Chagosians from going back home, sadly and terribly. One of the other victories, though, that the Chagosians won, despite defeating the British government 3 times in UK courts, 3 times the Chagosians won, and yet the British government has found ways to evade the courts. One of the other victories, to go back to Adam's question that I didn't address, was that as a result of their victories, they were able to, with the help of some members of parliament, when British citizenship law was changing to give all the residents of the remaining British colonies full British citizenship, they were included in that changed nationality legislation as a result of their victories and support from members of parliament, including the former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who actually has been their strongest supporter for decades.
Great.
We tried to invite Ambassador Snoxell, who leads the Chagosian All-Parliamentarian. He's the coordinator of that group and works closely with Jeremy Corbyn, but he unfortunately declined our request to participate in this. And we were provided his contact information by another fellow we had also reached out to try to invite him as a co-panelist alongside yourself, Peter Sand, who has described, Diego Garcia as the black hole in the Indian Ocean when it comes to legislation, where all sorts of policies apply to any other jurisdiction just either don't apply or are selectively applied to an extent where it could be a very perverse twisting of the international laws.
Yeah, no, it is. It really is more than many folks know about Guantanamo Bay and the prison there. And now in the week of the 20th anniversary of 9/11, people might recall the CIA black sites. Where people were tortured. Diego Garcia was actually originally considered as an alternative to the location for the prison that ended up in Guantanamo Bay, because it is also a kind of black site and black hole when it comes to the law. The US and British governments, operate there outside the law. And sadly, there are US and British officials who have enjoyed that privilege and that power. You mentioned, our all-parliamentary group. There are people who have come to support the Chagossians in Britain, in the US, in parts of Africa, other parts of Europe. So their movement has gained strength and gained support from people around the world, so that in many ways they are closer now to returning than they've ever been. But they still aren't home yet and need more support and more people, frankly, to know about what happened to the Chagossians and to come to rally to assist them and put pressure on the US and British government to let them go home.
What I wonder is there must be other populations in the world who are in situations similar to those of the Chagossians. And I just wish, that there could be an international organization representing the interests of all such communities, so that if you have big numbers, sometimes that adds political power. And I wonder if there's any effort that you know of to create an international organization to represent the interests of all such populations. And of course, I have no idea how many comparable groups there are in the world that would have something in common with these people.
It's a great question. And then let me tell you, there are more than 20 people. I've been able to document more than 20 groups of people, almost entirely indigenous people, who have been displaced from their homelands or their homes by US military bases abroad since the late 19th century. So in roughly the last 120, 130 years, there are more than 20 groups of people like the Chagossians who've been displaced from their homes by the creation or expansion of a US military base abroad, meaning outside the 50 states and Washington, DC. The Chagossians have been able to work with some of those displaced peoples, like some in Guam who were displaced. The entire population of Guam wasn't displaced, but many hundreds, if not thousands of people in Guam, Chamorros, were displaced from their lands. The Chagossians have been able to work with people in Okinawa who also were displaced in mass displacements after World War II. And the Chagossians have gained support from others who are in anti-base movements, meaning they are opposed to the imposition of foreign military bases on their soil for a variety of reasons, including people being displaced, but for other reasons as well. The Chagossians have also received support from other indigenous people. They've been recognized by indigenous peoples at the United Nations as an indigenous people. Sometimes the Chagossians people think, oh, their ancestors are only there since the late 18th century. That's not indigenous, but indeed, under international law and according to other indigenous people, they are indeed, the Chagossians are the indigenous people of the Chagos archipelago, in no small part because there's no other population that preceded them there. Mm-hmm. So the Chagossians have gained support, but your idea of an organization or entity that would bring displaced peoples together is actually an intriguing one, and one perhaps I'll raise with some of the Chagossians.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Well, now let's turn from the plight of the human rights issue of the Chagossians to something that I'm much more often concerned with myself, and that is the spread of militarism and especially American bases. I don't know that much about American bases as such, but this is clearly one of the leading examples of American hegemony and effort to dominate the world. And I wonder, you mentioned something in passing that it's not only an air base, but a naval place. I looked at some images from the air, and I saw a whole bunch of fighter planes, what looked like fighter planes, parked there. There might have been 50 of them or so on one of those islands, someplace there. But I didn't realize that it was also a place for ships to dock. What kind of a harbor is it?
Yeah, it's mostly the air base is mostly a home for long-range bombers, B-52, B-2, B-1 bombers, as well as some surveillance aircraft. And the Navy base they've got a port that's big enough for an aircraft carrier, for submarines, and they have very large pre-positioned ships. So these are ships, cargo ships, about the size of the Empire State Building, massive, full of equipment and supplies for an entire Marine brigade. And they just sit there, these cargo ships, with basically supplies and weapons in shrink wrap, and then have been deployed before both the first and the second Gulf War, the first and the second invasions and wars in Iraq. These cargo ships were deployed to the borders.
Let me guess. These are ships full of supplies that are ready if the United States actually lands troops someplace and they need rations or whatever. That's what that is for. What areas could they possibly service with the supplies from these ships?
Well, so the part of the reason U.S. government officials like Diego Garcia is that while it's quite isolated, on the one hand, that provides some security. It also is within striking distance of a large swath of the globe, from Southern Africa to the Middle East to South Asia and Southeast Asia. And the advantage in their mind is that you can send these ships from Diego Garcia to, for example, the borders of Iraq more quickly than you can from the East Coast or West Coast of the United States. There's similar cargo ships in the Northern Mariana Islands. I think there's some in Guam as well, both colonies of the United States in the Pacific Ocean. And that's, again, why some U.S. government officials like having these bases.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Adam showed me a book of yours. Adam, hold it up again. Now, that is your book about Diego Garcia. Is that right?
That's right. It's a history of the military base on Diego Garcia, and a history of the Chagosians, and a history of their displacement and their lives in exile and their struggle to return home.
Good. Okay, now you also have a new book, The United States of War. And I'm assuming that has to do with military bases. Can you elaborate on what you talk about there? And I suppose that includes what you're able to find out about the military base on Diego Garcia.
Sure. Yeah. My research about the Chagosians really opened my eyes to the world of military bases, U.S. military bases abroad. Looking at Diego Garcia, I began asking, well, wait a second, why does the United States have a military base in the middle of the Indian Ocean? Does it need a military base in the middle of the Indian Ocean? Is this base protecting U.S. citizens or the world in any way? And this, again, opened my eyes to the hundreds of U.S. military bases that exist outside the United States. Currently, about 750 U.S. military bases outside the 50 states and Washington, D.C. in 80 countries and colonies, 750 bases in 80 countries and colonies. So I ended up writing a trilogy of books. After Island of Shame, I wrote a book called Base Nation about this huge network of military bases abroad, examining their impacts on the world and frequently the harm that they impose on the world and on U.S. citizens in the United States. And then more recently, the book, as you mentioned, United States of War, which looks at the larger war system through the lens of military bases. And it shows how the construction of military bases abroad, which U.S. government officials have been engaged in really since independence, has played a role in creating a self-perpetuating cycle of war that the United States has yet to escape from. We think about the last 20 years of war that the United States has been engaged in since the attacks of 9/11. People talk about it as the endless wars or forever war. And unfortunately, they will be endless or forever wars if we don't choose another path. But this last 20 years of war is not exceptional. My book, The United States of War, shows that in almost every year of US history, the US military has been fighting in a war or some other form of combat. In all but 11 years in US history, the US military has been fighting. So there has been this permanent, near permanent state of war, such that the United States has become, in a very literal way, a United States of war.
My God, are there people? How many people are there as in one of these bases? Is it like they build a bunch of buildings and supply them and so on, and then leave a skeleton crew there to maintain it, or are there people who bring their families to live there and become kind of expatriate American communities in the world? What are these places like, both on Diego Garcia and if you can compare it to some of the other bases?
Yeah, a great question. So among the 750 US military bases abroad, there's a range in size from city-sized bases, what were frequently called America towns, or American towns, that were little Americas. They're so large, with tens of thousands of troops and family members, schools, hospitals, restaurants, fast food, all the trappings of a smaller, really not so small US American town, in places like Germany and Italy, Japan, and South Korea. So it ranges from that size to much smaller bases with just a few dozen or a few hundred troops, no family members, fewer amenities, and bases that are somewhere in between. Of course, Diego Garcia is not the largest base in the world, but it's a quite sizable base, but there are no family members. It's called an unaccompanied deployment. So they keep the numbers quite secretive, but they're, to the best of our understanding, a few thousand troops and contractors on Diego Garcia at any time.
Were you able to interview any of those folks? How, you said they're secretive. I can believe they would be, but how accessible is information about these bases and the people who've worked there?
A lot of the information is not very accessible. I wrote a book, Island of Shame, about a base I literally couldn't see. I couldn't visit Diego Garcia because if you're not in the US military, you can't go. And I applied for permission and was turned down on multiple occasions by both the British and US governments. That was part of the inspiration for writing Base Nation. It's actually much easier to go visit Guantanamo Bay, which I was able to visit on a couple occasions, and Base Nation is based on research in 14 countries and colonies that possess bases, and I've visited upwards of 60 bases around the world over now almost 20 years of research. But a lot of the information about this network of bases is kept quite secret. So even the number of bases, we don't know for sure. And we think the Pentagon doesn't even know for sure how many bases it has abroad. So one of the real problems, I mean, I pointed to the lies and secrecy that underline the whole story and history of the creation of the base on Diego Garcia and the expulsion of the Chagosians. There is similar secrecy around many US bases around the world and their operations. And there needs to be much more transparency about these bases, the conditions under which they were established, the legal conditions under which they were established, if any, and the effects that they're having on people around the world.
Okay, now I've read that there are nuclear weapons on Diego Garcia. How do you know? I mean, how does anybody know? And how much of that kind of information could a journalist or somebody, a researcher, find out about the location of nuclear weapons, the way they are maintained, And the potential targets, where would they be used if they were actually launched?
It's extraordinarily difficult to know about nuclear weapons virtually everywhere in the world. And I'm not sure if we have definitive information or documentation that there are nuclear weapons on Diego Garcia. We know that there's, as I mentioned, an Air Force and Navy presence, there's an NSA presence, there's a CIA presence, there's a Space Force presence. So the long-standing assumption is that Diego Garcia is home to at least some nuclear weapons. We know that it is a harbor for nuclear armed submarines. So it plays a role in the US nuclear arsenal. But around the world, there's tremendous secrecy around US nuclear weapons and where they are located. In Japan, there's longstanding understanding that the Chagosian, that nuclear weapons are stored there despite the Japan's relationship to nuclear weapons. But it's another area that needs much more transparency, although the most important thing to say about nuclear weapons, of course, is that they must be abolished. People are rightly concerned about the existential threat of global warming, climate change, but far too often people forget that we could be extinguished as a species, and much of life on Earth could be extinguished today, given the number of nuclear weapons that still exist and are in the arsenals of the United States and a handful of other powers. Adam asked a question about displacements and nuclear weapons. In the Bikini Islands and other islands in the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, where the US carried out widespread nuclear testing in the 1950s and 1960s. And I think the testing there ended in the 1960s. Hundreds of people were displaced from several islands over a long period of time during that nuclear testing program, in addition to radiation and other damage that the nuclear testing caused to the people of the Marshall Islands.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we've done shows about the Marshall Islands, and everybody should know much more than they do about the Marshall Islands. In fact, I think one of the most shocking things I ever read was there was a film called Nuclear Savage or something, made about the Marshall Islands, and one of their leaders, I think a former prime minister, if they have such a thing, some political leader, had gone to Washington and through the Freedom of Information Act had gone through files looking at the records of the plans that had been developed and files for doing various kinds of experiments. And he was able to show that there were experimental protocols or plans for experimenting on irradiating mice and then following their health effects to see what are the consequences for their survival and their health. And that these, along the way, mice had been crossed out and Marshallese people had been substituted. Literally, they had taken on the experimentation on human bodies, which they treated as subhuman, as if they were experimental animals. And they're still, every year or so, they bring a bunch of Marshallese. I was talking to a woman this week in Hawaii, and she says they bring some people from the Marshall Islands for annual tests in Hawaii about their health status. So these are the most horrible examples of human rights violations. Acts of certainly could be charged under any human rights violation in court, ICC or so on. In the world, they should be prosecuted. but at least people should know about it, as a minimum.
No, you're of course exactly right, and far more than just people knowing about it. People are due justice for what they have suffered at the hands of, in the cases we're talking about, the U.S. and British governments, in the cases of the Chagosians. They're due compensation. The Marshall Islanders who've been affected by nuclear testings, some of them have received, again, small amounts of compensation, but the full compensation fund that they are due has not been fully funded by the US Congress. And the Chagosians have received no compensation from the US government, no apology, no recognition. So there's a long way to go to win justice for the Chagosians, but it is worth mentioning that the International Court of Justice, just in the past couple of years, ruled that British occupation of the Chagos Archipelago, including Diego Garcia, is unlawful, is against the UN's rules of decolonization. And the UN General Assembly followed this up, echoing the International Court of Justice, calling on Britain to give up its control of the Chagos Islands and return it to its the rightful sovereign, which is the government of Mauritius, because the islands of the Chagos Archipelago were, since the 19th century, connected to the colony of Mauritius. And when Mauritius gained its independence, the islands of the Chagos Archipelago had been stripped, had been simply excised, removed under British colonial rule from Mauritius. And the story is long, but if the Mauritian government regains its sovereignty or regains control over these islands, the Chagosians have allied with the Mauritian government and will likely be able to go home. There's also a hope that if Britain foolishly chooses not to abide by international law and the ruling of the International Court of Justice, that they would allow the Chagosians to return home. I mean, this is a problem that could be solved overnight. There's plenty of space for the Chagosians to go home. There's actually housing on Diego Garcia where contractors live and work, and new infrastructure could be built. The US and British governments could solve this problem and this really grievous human rights violation with relatively little trouble and relatively little money, especially compared to the billions invested in the base on Diego Garcia.
Okay, well, how it strikes me that the linchpin for the whole thing is changing American support, public opinion, away from their ongoing focus on militarism. That, in other words, what we hear now is some people say, well, what was wrong with us that we maintained this war in Afghanistan for 20 years? And this may focus attention on the more general question, what are we trying to do to dominate the whole world by maintaining bases and so on? So it looks to me like a big stretch to hope that Americans will suddenly say, yes, let's change from being war-loving to peace-building as a force in the world.
I think there are a good number of people who are saying that and beginning to listen to Barbara Lee, of course, who was the one member of Congress who stood up and opposed the US invasion and war in Afghanistan. I'm more optimistic, and I think, efforts like yours to talk about and educate people about the harmful effects of militarism and what I've called the United States of war, I think that's important. And I think actually the vast majority of people in the United States have turned against war. The vast majority of people in the United States would not support another large-scale ground invasion of a country. Now, the US military has found more surreptitious, covert ways to wage war with drones and special operations forces. So there's still a long way to go. But I think actually the anti-war movement from the 1960s to this day has been very successful in turning the population of the United States against war. Now, again, there's still a long way to go, especially in showing people the harmful impacts of militarism on their own lives in the United States. $8 trillion, 8 trillion with a T, $8 trillion has gone into wars since 2001. That's 8 trillion taxpayer dollars have been spent just on waging war.
US dollars?
US dollars alone have been spent, in addition to the British government, and Australian government, and other allies that have waged these wars alongside the United States. 8 trillion US taxpayer dollars have gone to waging war. And that's actually on top of the regular, quote unquote, regular Pentagon budget. So there's even more spending on war and preparations for war. But $8 trillion alone have gone to fight in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, the Philippines, and far beyond.
And that does not, are you saying that doesn't count these 750 bases, or does it?
It counts spending on some of the bases that have been involved in the wars. But indeed, the budget to maintain many of these other bases on an annual basis exceeds the $8 trillion. So indeed, it has been calculated that including all military spending since 2001, we reach a total of $21 trillion. $21 trillion. And this is simply 1 trillion is hard enough to conceive of. But just imagine what we could have done with, take the $8 trillion spent on wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and 25 countries where US combat troops have been deployed since 2001. $8 trillion, what we could have done with that. How many literally hundreds of thousands of lives could have been saved to the COVID pandemic alone if we'd invested.
I have to translate trillions into billions to be able to even comprehend it. A trillion is a billion, is 1,000 billion.
Yes.
So what you're saying is 8,000 billion. Is that right? $8,000 billion.
That's right. And we tend to think it starts to seem like, oh, a million, then a billion, then a trillion. So a trillion is not that much more than a billion. No, it's an exponentially larger than a billion.
1,000 billion. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
It's an unimaginable sum of money. And again, I think people in the United States in particular need to think about how else we could have spent that money. How many people have died, not just because of COVID, but because we don't have a universal healthcare system that could have been established with $8 trillion. You know, what could we have done to build a green infrastructure that could have saved us from global warming and climate change? What could we have done to rebuild our schools, send people to college, to rebuild streets and other forms of infrastructure, build an adequate train system in the United States, public transportation, bridges. It's $8 trillion is a sum that I think really should make us weep, in addition to the damage that these wars have caused on people from Afghanistan to Iraq, to Syria, to Yemen, to Somalia, and far beyond, and to the Chagossians. I think the Chagossians are among the victims of war, in addition to those in the countries I've named.
I want to thank you for what you're doing. This is really a very, very constructive, helpful research project. Keep doing it. Thank you so much. It's good to know you and to know that we've got allies.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your saying that, and I appreciate your interest in casting light on a story that too few people know about.
Bless you. All right. Carry on. Bye.
Thank you.